Say what's cracking, YouTube? It's your boy 16 to life, and I'm back like I'm on a parole violation. You're down. Now, for those of y'all that's new to my page, in 1994 I got arrested. I was eventually sentenced to 16 years plus life, and I served 24 years straight in the California prison system. During those times, I accumulated some good stories and some good insight on things related to prison. I'm going to share some with y'all today. If you happen to like this video, be sure to hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and most importantly, hit that notification bell. That way, anytime I drop a story, you'll be notified ASAP, and you can hop on it whenever you're ready. Also, man, do not get it twisted. I rap. My flow is nothing like Curtis Blow. Go to my YouTube playlist, scroll down to gas stations. You will find a lot of my songs there. I also got a song called Never Gave Me Therapy. It's on all major streaming sites, so definitely be sure to check that out. I gas. I recently done an interview on a channel called Authors Inside. Be sure to go check that out. I will try to remember to leave a link for that in the community. Now let's hop right up into this story. So this story came about, or this video, maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Somebody left a comment in my comment section, and they said, "So hey, chill, man, you mean to tell me that you done 24 years straight and you never got into a riot with the Southern Mexicans?" You know, and they left emojis or whatever. Then a few comments down, you had a Mexican, excuse me, saying, "Hey, well, you know, I done 12 or 13 years." And I think he said on level 4s or whatever, and he said, I was never involved in a riot with the blacks. He said he was a Mexican, and he said, you know, I've always got into it with the Woods and the Nazi lowriders, right? So I guess it's just all depends on the luck of the draw, what institution that you're happen to be at, right? I have been at institutions where there were riots between the blacks and the Mexicans on other yards, just not on the particular yard that I was on, and it didn't spill over to that particular yard. I was also in Ironwood, and we got into it and had a riot involving the blacks and the Asians. And in the building, a riot kicked off between the blacks and the Southern Mexicans, and I'll speak about that a little later, right? But I think that for people who've never gone to prison, and especially those outside of California, when they hear that California prisons are separated among racial lines, they instantly and automatically think about segregation and things of that nature. Well, for the most part in California prisons, the climate between the Southern Mexicans and the blacks is not an ongoing racial animosity day in and day out. We're not arch enemies as, let's say, the Southern Mexicans and the Northern Mexicans were at a time back in history, right? Actually, in many instances, the relationships with the blacks and the Southern Mexicans are cordial, and a lot of times even better than that, right? It just all depends, but we're never just on site, you know. We're just bickering and going at it every day. You know, it's never necessarily been like that outside of the times where there were immediate racial issues. Say you may have had a recent racial issue between a Southsider and a black, or maybe there was some unresolved issues brewing. So in those times, of course, you had to stay on high alert. But outside of that, it's just never been, you know, we've been at each other's throats on a day-to-day basis, right? Not too long ago in my comment a couple days ago too, black dude asked me a good question. He said, "Hey, chill, say you happen to be at a prison and the majority of kitchen workers were blacks and the Mexicans came to eat. Would they refuse to eat the food because it was being prepared by blacks?" The answer to that question is no. In that situation where people may hear that Mexicans are not allowed, Southern Mexicans are not allowed to take food from blacks, that only pertains to personal food from a black. So let me give you a scenario, right? You may be in the building, and your next door neighbor is a Mexican. Now let's say you made a spread and you had some whatever you had up in there, some seafood and chips and cheese and a soda. You couldn't go next door and offer that to him and expect for him to take it. He wouldn't take it in a situation like that. But now say that you're working in the kitchen and he's not going to refuse the food in a situation like that. You may have situations where, and I believe he asked me a question that was concerning the racial makeup of people working in the kitchen. But if you are at a particular prison and one race for whatever reason happens to be the majority at that prison, let's say you're at a prison and you have 600 whites at that prison, and you have 400 blacks, and you have 200 Mexicans. Well, all the jobs in the prisons, including the job in the kitchen, are going to reflect those numbers. They're not going to say, okay, well, we need 60 kitchen workers, so let's take 20 blacks, 20 Mexicans, 20 Hispanics, or whatever. Those numbers in that kitchen are going to reflect the population at that prison. So if there are more whites there, then of course you're going to have more whites in the kitchen, because everybody is entitled to a job equally and fairly. Jobs aren't decided among racial balance. I mean, they are, but they're not made out fair. The jobs are going to be consistent with the racial balance of that prison, right? And so you may have times where you have two different black factions who get into it with each other, right? And that entire black population, because of that incident between those two factions, the entire black population is slammed down. In some instances, the blacks will continually be fed with everybody else, meaning that when they release a building, the blacks, the whites, and the Mexicans come out and go to chow. I believe the brother also asked me something in relation to the food being messed with or something like that. Maybe not, but I have never seen or heard of where one race is intentionally trying to sabotage the food. Because when you come into the kitchen, the way most prisons are designed that I've been to, you come into the kitchen and the kitchen workers are working in a part of the kitchen that has a wall in it, and they're behind the wall, so you really can't see outside of it's a glass door, then a little slot. And so I say that to say, you don't know who's really coming to get the next tray. You might be able to count and say, okay, the homie is like 4 trays back, hook him up. But I've never been in a situation where somebody is messing with the food. Now, there may be times where, let's just say, the Crips and the Bloods get into it, and the administration feel it's easier or better or whatever to isolate the blacks and feed the Mexicans and the whites together, and then feed the blacks together. In that situation, you won't have any black kitchen workers going there, because when the blacks are locked down, then of course, they're not going to their jobs and stuff like that. So in that situation, you will only have Asians, Mexicans, and whites working in the kitchen serving the blacks. But once again, I've never seen one particular race refuse to go to the chow hall and get their food because another race is working in there and preparing it. At the end of the day, men are men, and there's always still a certain amount of respect shown. Which reminds me of one time I was in the hole in Corcoran, and this was the first time that I had been around Northern Mexicans and Southern Mexicans. And I had also heard that would go at it with each other. It was on site. And something that was surprising and commendable, when we were in the hole, they was all not only were they respectful of each other, they was past cordial, the relationship they had. And actually, there happened to be a Southern Mexican who would get a lot of magazines sent to him. Somebody was sending him, he had a bunch of different subscription to different magazines. Once he would read the magazines and let his homies read the magazines, the Southern Mexicans, he would then shoot the magazines to the Northern Mexicans and the blacks in there as well. So it's always a sense of mutual respect, which is something that, like I said, I found extremely commendable, because you have a lot of people in prison who feel that to be locked behind the cell door and yelling out, being disrespectful and talking stuff is extremely a cowardice act. If you have a problem with a person, when those doors open, go get your man or whatever. So that's how that situation played out, right? Now, I had mentioned earlier how I happened to be at a prison, which was Ironwood, and we got into a riot with the Asians, and then a riot ensued as a direct result of that riot. A riot jumped off in the building with the Southern Mexicans and the blacks. And so I'll explain that. Like I said earlier, you do have some things that are sectioned off behind racial lines. And so while we would play on this basketball court. It was a full-length basketball court with two rims. One rim was used solely for the Mexicans and the whites, and the other rim was used for the blacks and the Asians, with the exception of times when we had basketball tournaments, and sometimes the tournaments would involve the Mexicans and the whites, or the blacks and the Asians. Of course, we never mixed sports and played together. On this day in particular, the blacks are having a basketball tournament, which involves the Asians, I believe, or maybe it was just the Asians having the basketball tournament. But either or, there's also jerseys passed out so you can differentiate who's on what team. So you may have, blacks and Asians wearing orange jerseys and green jerseys or whatever. And so my homie happened to be having a discrepancy, my homie John, with an Asian over a bet about the NBA, the Lakers. And so behind that, a fight broke out. The fight, of course, led to a racial riot. And so now the fight breaks out maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the basketball rim that's used by the Mexicans. And so, of course, the fight jumps off. Beep, boop, bop, beep, boop, bop. Everybody squabbing. Beep, boop, bop, bop, bop. You have blacks and Asians fighting. And so the Southsiders on the yard can clearly look and see that this fight is between the blacks and the Asians. But the fight took place maybe about 20 or 30 feet from Building 4. Now, Building 4, as all buildings in Ironwood, they have a bottom tier and a top tier. The top tier happens to have several windows. And so normally, of course, when people go to squabbing on the yard, eventually the COs recognize that they hit the alarm. When the alarm is hit, people upstairs are going to go and look to the window to see what's going on, to determine if it's something that they need to be aware of, for their safety, so on and so forth. So when this fight is going on with the blacks and the Asians, which is something, especially back then, that was extremely rare, you have Mexicans in that building who looked outside. They saw blacks and brown people fighting on the Mexican side of the basketball court, and assumed that the blacks and the Mexicans were fighting, which was an honest mistake for them to make. So when they saw blacks fighting brown people, because the building is a bit of a distance from the basketball court, then of course, in the building, they're telling everybody to get down too, so they didn't have long to look out the window and see what was going on. They mistakenly assumed that the Mexicans and the blacks was fighting. And so, of course, they made the announcement in there, hey, we're fighting out there with the blacks, and it took off in the building. And so, after everything was resolved, the yard went down, the guards took control of everything. Once it was figured out that the Southern Mexicans made a mistake in judgment, but it was a logical mistake, that situation was resolved. No further incidents ensued from that situation. So that, I've also been on that particular yard when there happened to be a blood by the name of JJ. JJ was from San Diego, maybe about 5'9", dark-skinned brother. He was cool, but sometimes he was hot-headed, and he happened to get into one day out there on the track, he got into a verbal altercation with a Southern Mexican, and there was almost a riot, jumped off, some grouping and stuff, but cooler heads prevailed. So I've been in situations where there have been standoffs between the blacks and the Mexicans, but there was never any type of riot, like I said, which is definitely a blessing, because we know that these riots can definitely get violent, they can get dangerous, and you've had riots where people have actually been maimed for the rest of their lives, stabbed, injured, and some people actually have lost their lives. I happened to interview this one brother by the name of, I believe his name was Raheem Butler, and he had the misfortune in being in two of the more well-known publicized riots that took place in prison between the Southern Mexicans and the blacks. He happened to be in that Pelican Bay riot, where unfortunately someone lost their life. There was a lot of people stabbed and injured. You guys can Google and check that out on YouTube. And then he also was in a riot that jumped off in New Folsom, which was between the blacks and the Southern Mexicans. Unfortunately for him, in that riot, he was shot. and almost lost his life. And if you haven't seen that interview, go check that out. It's called "The Day Pelican Bay Erupted," I believe is the name of that riot, or excuse me, is the name of that video. From time to time, I'll get a lot of Asians asking me, "Hey, chill, man, why don't you have more content pertaining to Asians?" And actually, like I said, I do have some videos. That video that that story that I just talked about in Ironwood with the riot between the blacks and the Asians. That excuse me. The name of that video is "Prison Riot: Asians versus the Blacks." I also have another video called "The Asian Car Gets Active." That's a pretty good story right there. So be sure to check that out. I also interviewed an Asian a couple of months ago. I don't offhand remember the name of that video, but anyway, that's one reason right there. I guess you can just really just say, man, just being in the right prison at the right time. Would I prefer to have been in a couple of riots with the Southern Mexicans so I can come on here and give you guys a good story? Not at all. Like I said, those riots are definitely ugly. People get hurt. Sometimes people lose their lives, maimed, stabbed in the eyes and stuff like that. Or you also have people who, due to their participation in those riots, being seen stabbing somebody or what have you, sometimes you get people who get completely new charges and a lot of time tacked on to the time that they are already doing. So yeah, but it happens. Sometimes you may have people who have been in jail maybe 2 or 3 years and they get involved in 5 or 6 riots. It just all happens to depend on what particular prison that you're at. For the most part, nobody really wants to get caught up in a riot, because when you have two large factions like the blacks and the Southern Mexicans, and of course it's going to be a lot of people involved in those riots, the administration at times may lock both of those particular races down, sometimes for a month or two, sometimes for 2 or 3 years, depending on how long that violence plays out. Maybe they may lock you down initially for 2 or 3 weeks, let the blacks and the Mexicans out, and they start fighting again and stuff like that. And so, during these times, these lockdowns, of course, there are no phones, there's no packages, there's no visits, and there's very little movement. So the few things that convicts get in prison on both sides to make doing their time a little easier is harder to obtain due to it being very little movement. And so, of course, when cooler heads can prevail, they do prevail. A lot of times when you do have these riots between the blacks and the Southern Mexicans, 9 times out of 10, they're always behind two things, and that's disrespect and money. And a lot of times, the disrespect is because somebody owes somebody some money, and so those are a lot of times the catalyst behind these riots between the blacks and the Hispanics. Like I say, unfortunate enough for me, I have never been involved in one of those. I did happen to get into a fight in the county jail with a South Sider, but of course I've never been involved in a riot. But anyway, you already know what it is. It's your boy 16 to life. Resume normal program.